My name is Claire Jensen, and I'm 36. I've survived night shifts, emergency surgeries, and the silent guilt of telling one family their son didn't make it. But nothing prepared me for walking into my sister's wedding alone. No one said anything outright, but I saw it. The glance that lingered a second too long, the quiet pity behind champagne flutes, and the way her fiancé's cousin whispered, "She must be hard to love." All that intensity. I almost left. I almost walked straight back to the parking lot, heels clicking like a slow surrender. But something stopped me. And by the end of that night, the most powerful man in that entire family stood up and bowed to me. Before I tell you what he said, where are you watching from? Have you ever been judged for not fitting their mold? Hit subscribe if you've ever walked into a room and felt like they'd already decided who you were, because this story might be yours too. Have you ever been judged for not fitting their mold? Hit subscribe if you've ever walked into a room and felt like they'd already decided who you were, because this story might be yours too. I didn't mind being placed at the singles table. I've eaten alone more times than I can count. Cafeterias during residency, coffee breaks between surgeries, microwave dinners at 2 a.m. Alone never scared me, but that night, it felt different. The table wasn't just for singles. It was for the misfits, the unclaimed, the ones they didn't know where to seat. I sat across from a cousin I barely knew and a college friend of the groom who'd already asked me twice if I'd considered freezing my eggs. 2 seats away, a woman I hadn't even met asked if I was the one who married her job. I smiled, politely, and took another sip of water. No wine. I'd need my clarity. To them, my empty +1 wasn't just a seat. It was a statement. A gap that screamed she couldn't find someone. Something must be wrong with her. They didn't say it out loud, but they didn't have to. You learn to read the room after years of being the one who walks in without a hand to hold. And what's worse is when the person you came for, your own sister, doesn't fill the silence, doesn't say, "She's a trauma surgeon. She saves people." Doesn't say, "She's more than enough even alone." She just watches, smiles, moves on, because fitting in with his family matters more than defending me. And I get it. I do. But sitting there, surrounded by people measuring my worth by the absence of someone beside me, I felt like I'd been seated at a table I hadn't earned. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because I was too much of the wrong kind of success. I looked at the empty seat next to me, not with longing, but with the quiet ache of being misunderstood. And I remembered all the other empty seats I've sat beside, at Cousin Amanda's wedding, at my med school reunion, even at Mom's retirement party, where someone asked if I was still single before they asked about my work. They meant well. They always do. But judgment disguised as curiosity still cuts, still lingers, still reminds you that in some rooms, a woman alone is still considered lacking. And just when I thought I could handle it, just when I convinced myself I'd keep smiling through the whispers, I overheard something behind the kitchen doors. They always said they were proud of me. Proud when my name showed up in medical journals. Proud when I became the youngest trauma surgeon at St. Francis. Proud when I was interviewed on local TV after a 17-car pileup that left 11 people alive because I wouldn't stop working. But somewhere between the headlines and the heart of the family, the pride thinned out. Because no matter how many lives I saved, there was always one question waiting at the end of every family dinner. "But are you happy, Claire?" And what they meant wasn't, "Are you fulfilled? Are you at peace?" They meant, "Why are you still alone?" To them, success was something you wore, not something you lived. It looked like a ring, a house with a name, not an address, 2 kids by 35, and a man who introduced you at parties with his hand at your waist. My achievements were impressive, until they were compared to Kimberly's engagement photos. She had the boat trips, the Sunday brunches, the future in-laws who knew which fork went with which course. I had trauma shifts, call nights, and coffee cups with my name spelled wrong at 3 a.m. And while no one ever said I made the wrong choice, the message was loud in other ways, like when my mother suggested I bring anyone, to the wedding, just so it doesn't look like you're, still stuck in that phase. That phase was my entire life's work. Or when Aunt Marion said, "Your cousin just got engaged to a dentist. You two should talk. You have so much in common." Right. Because nothing screams compatibility like 2 people who both own scrubs. At some point, I stopped trying to explain, stopped trying to prove that my life had meaning beyond someone else's last name. But even the strongest people crack, and that crack began to widen when I heard what they said near the kitchen. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone, the way they bent their heads close, glasses in hand, like gossip had a flavor best served with champagne. I hadn't meant to hear. I just stepped outside the pavilion, hoping for air, and caught the end of a sentence that sliced sharper than any scalpel I've held. Poor Kimberly. Her sister's still single, isn't she? Can you imagine showing up to a wedding alone at that age? Then the punchline. Soft laughter. And those shoes? Practical. Always a dead giveaway. My breath caught, not from rage, from recognition. Because those weren't strangers talking. They were cousins of the groom. People who had shaken my hand just hours ago. Told me they'd heard I was the brilliant doctor from Boston. Now I was a punchline in kitten heels. I stepped back, heart pounding, the tile beneath my shoes suddenly less stable than an operating room mid-code blue. And as I turned to retreat, the door swung open. Eleanor, poised, polished, and perfectly aware. She gave a tight smile, her words sweet as acid. "Melanie, I was just looking for another bottle of champagne." As if I hadn't heard it all. As if her silence behind those whispers didn't scream complicity. I should have said something. Should have reminded her that while they were critiquing my footwear, I was wearing orthopedic soles because I'd been on my feet for a 14-hour surgery the day before. But I didn't. Because when cruelty wears pearls and says it with a smile, responding feels like giving them permission to label you bitter. So I nodded, said I needed air, and left. Not just the kitchen hallway, but the illusion that I still belonged in that version of family, because in that moment, I wasn't the sister of the bride. I was the cautionary tale they whispered about, the woman who had too much ambition and not enough arm candy. And the worst part? Kimberly knew. She saw it in my face when I returned. Asked if I was okay. I said I was tired from the drive. She didn't press. Maybe she knew pressing too hard would shatter the only grace we had left between us. I smiled, sat back at the table where my +1 should have been, and quietly braced myself for the next round of conversation. But what I didn't expect was that it would come again. This time, louder, harsher, and right in front of me. They say dignity is quiet, but they never tell you how loud the silence feels. When you're holding back everything you could say just to keep someone else's day from unraveling. After the kitchen incident, I nearly left. I had my wrap in one hand, my clutch in the other, and my car keys halfway out of my purse. There's something sobering about standing alone in a hallway of a mansion, surrounded by gold-framed art and conversations that never quite include you. I wasn't just tired. I was worn thin. Years of holding it together. Of smiling when people mistook my ambition for arrogance. Of lowering my volume so others could feel tall. And now? Now they were laughing about me in rooms I wasn't meant to hear. Comparing me to a cautionary tale no one remembered writing. A part of me whispered, "Leave. Go back to Boston. Back to a world where you're respected for what you do, not who you bring." I even glanced at my phone. A text from the hospital. A colleague checking if I could cover an early morning shift. The perfect excuse. The clean exit. No drama. No confrontation. But I didn't reply. Not yet. Because something inside me, something stubborn and steady and deeply mine, refused to let them write the ending. Not like this. Not as the woman who left early because she couldn't take a joke. I didn't want to ruin Kimberly's night. She was my sister. Flawed, yes. But still the girl I once shared bunk beds with, who braided my hair before every science fair. I owed her that much. So I walked back in, sat at my seat like it didn't burn, laughed when appropriate, clapped when the speeches ended, and I reminded myself, sometimes showing up and staying silent is the loudest thing you can do, but the battle wasn't over, because just when I thought I'd endured the worst of it. A comment floated across the table, low, casual, cutting. "She's brilliant, but no social graces. What a waste." This time I didn't flinch, didn't run, because what they didn't know was that someone else had been listening too, and he was about to speak. Have you ever stayed somewhere, not because you were welcome, but because you refused to leave quietly? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your version of staying strong. Number 5. The man who saw her before anyone else did. He didn't say much at first, just watched. From the far end of the family table, an older man with sharp eyes and a posture that hadn't yet bowed to age. I'd noticed him the night before too. He was the only one who didn't look away when I walked in alone, didn't scan my finger for a ring or ask the polite version of, "Why are you here?" Solo. Instead, his gaze held something else. Curiosity. Not the nosy kind. The kind that comes from a life lived long enough to know that appearances often lie. When others saw a woman without a date, he saw something else. I found out later his name was Walter, patriarch of the groom's family, founder of a shipping empire, a man who'd buried a wife, raised children, and, just last year, nearly lost a granddaughter. He'd seen things, hard things, things that teach you to look beneath the surface. While the others whispered about shoes and singleness, Walter watched how I listened, how I stood when the elderly aunt dropped her napkin, how I stayed when I could have left. He noticed what others ignored, and when the insult at the dinner table landed, the one meant to sting without consequence, he didn't laugh, didn't smirk, didn't look away. Instead, he stood, slowly, deliberately. The chatter quieted, confused at first, then curious. Because when a man like Walter rises in the middle of a wedding reception, people notice. He didn't look at the speaker, didn't call anyone out. He looked at me, and I knew, before he said a single word, that something was about to shift. I held my breath. Because sometimes vindication doesn't come with noise, it comes with stillness. And one person, finally, choosing to speak the truth out loud. Number 6, the bow that redefined her story. He didn't rush. Walter's movements were careful, not because he was fragile, but because he knew the weight of what he was about to do. As he walked toward me, the music faded, the conversation dulled, and every pair of eyes turned. It was the kind of silence that wraps itself around a room, waiting. I stood up slowly, unsure of what was happening, unsure if I was being summoned or spotlighted, or both. And then he said it, in a voice that didn't need a microphone. "This woman," he began, "once stood in an operating room for 14 hours to save my granddaughter's life." The room froze. I felt the air shift. Even the chandeliers above seemed to hold their breath. He went on, describing the injuries, the impossibility, the odds no one expected me to beat. And then he said something I'll never forget. Some people measure worth by companionship or charm, or what name appears on the seating chart. I measure it by courage, by who shows up when it matters most. And then, this man, this powerful, respected patriarch of a family that had whispered about me all weekend, bowed. A full, deliberate bow, before me, not as a favor, not out of politeness, but out of truth. And with that gesture, he rewrote the entire story, because suddenly, I wasn't the woman who came alone. I was the woman who saved someone they loved, the woman who mattered before they knew it, and still mattered after. Across the room, I saw Eleanor's face pale, Jessica and Thomas suddenly very, very small. But I didn't gloat, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about being seen, fully, finally, clearly, for everything I'd fought for, everything I'd built, everything I'd carried alone all these years, being enough. Not in spite of being single, but because of who I chose to become. And as Walter stepped aside and his granddaughter Lisa approached with tears in her eyes, I realized something. I hadn't needed someone to stand beside me. I just needed someone brave enough to stand for me. There were so many things I could have said. I could have turned to Jessica and Thomas, repeated every word they'd whispered behind the kitchen doors. I could have asked Eleanor if modern womanhood still looked like pearls and passive aggression. I could have reminded the room that while they debated social decorum, I was holding beating hearts in my hands, literally, but I didn't. Because by the time Walter finished speaking, I didn't need to prove anything. They had already seen it, heard it, felt it. And for once, my work, my quiet, grueling, deeply personal work, stood taller than any witty comeback ever could. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list my accolades. I didn't weaponize my title. I simply looked at Lisa, the young woman whose life had intersected with mine in a trauma bay 6 months prior, and said the only words that mattered. "I'm glad you're here." And I meant it. Because in that moment, she wasn't just a patient, she was proof. Proof that showing up matters, that staying late matters, that skipping parties and holidays, and yes, even relationships, sometimes leads to something far bigger than social approval. People often think silence is weakness, but silence with substance? Silence backed by truth? That's strength in its purest form. I didn't defend myself, because I didn't have to. The room had already shifted. The judgment had already cracked. And the weight I'd been carrying, it no longer felt like shame. It felt like purpose. And while others scrambled to rethink their opinions, I simply returned to my seat, but not the one at the end of the singles table. Number Walter pulled out a chair at the center of the family table and said, with all the authority of a man who's built both empires and character, "Dr. Jensen belongs here." And I took that seat, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to myself that I never needed their approval to be whole. That night, I didn't dance with a partner, didn't pose for couple photos, didn't catch anyone's lingering glance across the room, and yet, I've never felt more seen, Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't asked why I was alone. I wasn't measured by who stood beside me, but by what I stood for. Respect didn't come because I finally fit into their world. It came when I stopped trying to. When I took my seat at that family table, it wasn't because I'd suddenly become more lovable, more elegant, or more acceptable. It was because someone brave enough, Walter, recognized something they all had missed. I had always belonged. They just hadn't been ready to admit it. And maybe that's the point. We spend so much of our lives trying to belong, to families, to friend groups, to traditions that were never designed with us in mind. We shrink, we soften, we bring placeholders to weddings and stay quiet at dinner tables. But what if we stopped? What if we showed up as ourselves, fully, unapologetically, beautifully other? That night didn't make me whole. It didn't fix years of judgment or erase the loneliness that sometimes creeps in on quiet nights. But it did remind me that dignity isn't about being accepted by the crowd. It's about standing so firmly in who you are that the crowd has no choice but to make room. When I drove home the next morning, the seat next to me was still empty, but it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like space, for breath, for clarity, for someone, someday, who wouldn't need me to explain why I chose this life. Only someone who'd be honored to walk beside me in it. But even if that person never comes, I'll be okay, because I've already built something stronger than approval, self-respect. And sometimes it takes walking in alone to show the world you never needed to be rescued, just recognized. If this story reminded you of your own quiet strength, or someone you know who walks alone with their head high, drop a comment below and hit subscribe. Because here, we don't chase belonging, we build it.